The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, slipped under 4 separate doors in 4 separate cities, each one sealed with the same ivory wax and stamped with the initials RHC. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper, handwritten in the careful script of a man who had spent his life making things permanent. The letter was not long. Raymond Harold Crane, 73 years old, patriarch of Crane Capital Management and the controlling interest in 2 regional banks and a logistics company that moved freight across 11 states, had issued a challenge to his heirs. Each of them would receive $40 in cash. Each of them would have exactly 30 days. The rules were simple. No credit cards, no outside money, no help from the family account. Whatever they had in their personal savings at the start of the month would be cleared to zero by the family's attorney, held in trust and returned at the end. They would start with $40. They would live on it. At the end of 30 days, they would gather at the family's estate outside Charlotte and present their ledgers. The heir who made it, Raymond wrote, would understand what the money had always meant. He did not explain what he meant by made it. He did not need to. All 4 of his children knew that the old man had grown up with nothing and that he had never forgiven any of them for growing up with everything. What none of them knew on that Tuesday morning in October was that only one of them was going to pass. And she had been living close to $40 her whole life. Her name was Deja. She was 31 years old, and Raymond Crane had signed her adoption papers when she was 9, in a courthouse in Greensboro, in a dress she had borrowed from a girl down the hall at the group home because it was the nicest thing available, and she had wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, to look like she belonged somewhere. Deja had not forgotten that dress. She had not forgotten a lot of things. If you've ever known someone who grew up counting not to pass the time but to survive, stay with this story, because what happened to Deja Crane that October was not luck. It was a lifetime of practice finally being witnessed. The 3 biological children were Marcus, 40, a real estate developer in Atlanta who drove a $90,000 truck and kept a membership at 2 private clubs. There was Simone, 37, who lived in a high-rise condo in uptown Charlotte and ran a consulting firm that billed $400 an hour, and which, as far as anyone could tell, mostly billed the family holding company. And there was Caleb, 29, the youngest of the birth children, who had graduated from a coastal law school 3 years earlier, and who had not yet held a job that lasted longer than 18 months. Deja was the one in between Marcus and Simone, age-wise, but she had never quite fit between them in any other sense. She had been adopted into a family that was already rich, which meant she had arrived already behind, in a language she was expected to speak fluently. She had tried. She had gone to the right schools and worn the right clothes and smiled at the right dinners. She had learned the vocabulary. She had learned to hold a wine glass the way Simone held it, and to give the right answer when someone asked where she summered. She had never stopped knowing how to do the other thing, the older thing, the thing she had known at 8 years old in a group home in Greensboro. How to make nothing into something. How to eat off $1. How to stretch a week's groceries across 10 days. How to find warmth without spending money and dignity without spending pride. She worked as a social worker for the county, a job that paid $38,000 a year before taxes, and which her brother Marcus had once referred to at a family dinner as the charity work. She had smiled. She had not said anything. She had, that night, driven home to her apartment in a section of Charlotte that the rest of the family did not visit, and sat for a while in the quiet and let herself feel, just briefly, the particular loneliness of belonging nowhere completely. She had $41 in her checking account when the envelope arrived, which meant the attorney's reset left her with almost exactly what she already had. The month began. Marcus hired a driver for the first morning before he remembered that the family card was locked. He spent 11 of his $40 at a gas station that afternoon, on a sandwich and a large coffee and a bottle of water, because he was accustomed to spending without watching, and the watching had not yet started. He had $29 left by Tuesday evening and 3.5 weeks of October still ahead of him. He stood in his kitchen that night, a kitchen with a 6-burner gas range and Italian marble counters he had paid $12,000 to have installed, and he opened the refrigerator and looked at the food inside and did not know what any of it cost, or how long it would last, or whether you could turn a half-block of aged cheese and a container of leftover Thai takeout into something that would carry him through tomorrow. He was a man who understood leverage and zoning variances and the precise calculation of depreciation schedules. He didn't understand his own kitchen. He spent most of day 2 watching television in his living room because going outside cost money and staying in cost nothing. On day 3, he discovered that the takeout containers were gone and the cheese was gone, and the only thing left was a bag of rice he had bought 2 years ago and never opened, and he did not know how to cook rice. He found a tutorial on his phone and boiled it in a saucepan and ate it plain, and sat with the bowl for a while and tried to remember if he had ever in his adult life eaten a meal that had cost him nothing. He called Raymond that evening. Raymond did not answer. Simone called her assistant on day 2 to ask if the office petty cash could front her for lunch. Her assistant, who had worked for Simone for 4 years without a raise, said she would look into it and did not call back. Simone went to the coffee shop below her building and stood at the counter and looked at the menu and realized for the first time in her adult life that she was calculating. The cheapest thing on the menu was $4.50. She left without ordering. On the sidewalk outside, she stood for a moment in the October wind and felt something she could not immediately name, which was the sensation of not knowing what to do next. She had not felt it since the first week of college, when the credit card her father had given her had not yet arrived and she had eaten crackers and peanut butter for 3 days and called Raymond in tears, and Raymond had wired $300 that same afternoon. There was no wire coming this month. She understood that completely. What she had not understood until this moment on a cold sidewalk with $4.50 between herself and a cup of coffee was that the wire had always been there every time her whole life, and that she had never once had to solve the problem herself. She moved back to the estate on day 3. She told herself it was within the rules. Caleb made it 4 days before he called Raymond's housekeeper, a woman named Estelle who had been with the family for 22 years, and asked her to lend him $50. Estelle, who had loved that family faithfully and without recognition for 2 decades, told him she was sorry, she couldn't, and then sat down at her own kitchen table and felt a feeling she could not quite name. It was something adjacent to relief, and it took her a few minutes to understand why. She had said no to one of the Crane children, to his face, out of necessity rather than deference. She had said she was sorry, and she had meant it, and she had not bent. The feeling was the feeling of a line held, which she had not known she needed to hold until it was tested. Deja did not call anyone. She had not expected to. On the first morning, she took stock. She wrote the number 40 on a piece of paper and drew a line underneath it and began to list. She had a bag of rice in the cabinet, half a canister of oats, a partial bottle of cooking oil, and an onion. She had 4 eggs. She had a bus pass that was still good for 9 more days. She had her library card, which cost nothing, and her employee ID badge, which got her into the county building where there was heat and free Wi-Fi. She had a phone plan that was paid through the month. She had a neighbour named May who was 70 and who grew collard greens in pots on her balcony, and who every few weeks left a bundle of them on Deja's doorstep because she said she grew too many for herself and didn't like to see things go to waste. Deja did not count May's greens as charity. She had been bringing May's groceries up the stairs every Saturday morning for 2 years without being asked and without mentioning it. The ledger filled slowly, carefully. She bought a pound of dried beans on day 2 for $1.17. She bought a dozen eggs on day 4, on sale for $2.40. She bought a head of cabbage. She bought cornmeal. She found a piece of pork neck at the discount rack of the grocery store on day 6, marked down because it was close to date, and she paid 98 cents for it and used it to flavour 3 days of beans. She seasoned with salt from a small container she already had, and with the dried thyme she kept on the back shelf, the kind that comes in a yellow tin and costs $1 and goes on for months. She did not buy what she did not need. She did not buy what she already had. She knew the difference, which was a skill that turned out, when you needed it, to matter more than any of the others. She walked to work on the days she didn't have bus credit, which was most of them by the second week. It was 4 miles each way, along a route she had learned so well. She knew which sections of sidewalk were cracked and where the streetlight was out, and which corner store had a water fountain in back that still worked. She wore her good shoes with thick socks, and she left 40 minutes early, and she arrived at her desk each morning without complaint and did her job. The walking was not misery. She had walked more than this as a child, in shoes that were 2 sizes too small, with no particular destination and no one expecting her. Walking 4 miles with a destination and a desk at the end of it was not hardship. It was Tuesday. She thought, walking, about the families on her caseload and the things she needed to do for them. She composed emails in her head, she rehearsed conversations, she noticed things she had stopped noticing from inside a car. The dry cleaner on the corner that had a help wanted sign for 3 years running, the woman who walked a small dog every morning at 6:45 and always stopped to let it drink from a puddle in the same gutter, the man who set up a folding table on the sidewalk every Friday and sold homemade tamales from a cooler and always had a line by 7 in the morning. She made a mental note about the tamale man. She would mention him to her supervisor as a possible referral resource. She was always building the map of what existed and who could be connected to whom, because in her experience that was what kept people from falling all the way through. Not the big money, the map. At work, she was the person families called when they had nowhere else to call. She had a caseload of 19 families that month, and 3 of them were in crisis. One was a woman named Paulette, who had 2 small children and an eviction notice, and an ex-husband who was not paying what the court had ordered. One was an elderly man named James who had missed too many dialysis appointments because he could not afford the fare to the clinic and would not ask anyone for help. One was a teenager, 16, who had aged out of a placement and was sleeping in a friend's car and needed someone to sit beside her at the county office while she filled out forms and tried not to look as frightened as she was. Deja sat with all of them. She made phone calls on their behalf. She drove James to his Tuesday appointment out of her own gas money, which she could not spare and which she did not record in her ledger because she could not record it without also recording what it had been worth, and she didn't know a number large enough. The late evenings and early mornings meant the particular weight of carrying other people's emergencies home in her chest even after the day was done. She ate her beans and rice at the kitchen table with the family's paperwork spread in front of her and thought about solutions. She didn't mention the challenge to anyone at the office. It was not theirs to carry. There was a woman in the cubicle beside hers named Ruth who brought a full pot of rice and stew every Monday and left it in the break room for anyone who wanted some, because she said she always cooked too much on Sundays. Deja had eaten from Ruth's pot many times over the 3 years they had worked together. She had never asked where the rice came from or what it cost. She had simply been grateful and had washed the container and had returned it to Ruth's desk with a word of thanks and had come back the following Monday. This, she thought as she spooned her way through October, was how it worked. This was the whole economy that the Crane estate could not see. The Tuesday pot of rice, the neighbour's greens, the 2 quarters from a stranger, the woman who drove you to your appointment when the county van did not come. It was not tracked. It did not appear on any ledger that Harold would recognise. It was the oldest economy there was, and it kept an enormous number of people alive. On day 11, she had spent $17.82. She had $22.18 remaining and 19 days left in the month. She sat with that number and felt something she recognised from childhood, a certain calibration, the way a child learns to trust the math, because the math is all there is. Other children trust adults. Children who grew up in group homes learn to trust the ledger instead, because the ledger doesn't go away in the night. She turned the notebook page and looked at her projections. If she spent $1.17 a day for the remaining 19 days, she would arrive at day 30 with 29 cents. $1.17 a day was $4.68 in the next 4 days, which was rice and beans and whatever Ruth brought Monday. It was possible. It had always been possible. She had known on day 1 that it was possible, which was not the same as knowing it would be easy. It was not easy. It was the specific kind of difficult that she had first learned to navigate at the age of 7, which was the difficulty of making the numbers say yes when every impulse said, how much more? She had 19 days and $22.18. She set the notebook down and made her lunch, which was rice with half an onion fried in a small cap of oil, and she ate it at the window looking out at the parking lot below, where a man in a delivery uniform was eating a sandwich in his truck with the window down. And she thought about all the ways people managed their $40 without calling it a challenge, without a spiral notebook, without a father who owned 2 banks and a logistics empire and needed to know whether his children had learned anything. She thought about Paulette with her eviction notice and her 2 children. She thought about James and his dialysis clinic. She thought about the teenager in the car. She thought about them often during that month, more than she thought about herself, which was perhaps the most accurate ledger entry of all. Across town, in a hotel he had checked into on day 5 when his apartment felt unbearable without the comforts he was used to, Marcus had run out of money. He discovered this by reaching into his wallet at a drive-through window and finding nothing. He drove away from the window without his order. He sat in the parking lot for a long time. He called Raymond. Raymond did not answer. He had not answered any of the calls from Marcus or Simone or Caleb that month. He was home at the estate outside Charlotte, and he was watching the month pass, and he was very still. There was a man named Harold, Raymond's personal attorney and the person who had administered the envelope and the reset, and Harold knew the terms. No outside money, no exceptions. If any of them broke the rules, they would disqualify themselves. Raymond had been clear. On day 14, Marcus borrowed $300 from a friend named Devon and went to a restaurant for dinner. He did not know that Harold had been watching. The disqualification was quiet and immediate. Simone lasted slightly longer. She had grown up with Raymond and she understood, better than Marcus, that the old man was serious. She moved back into her childhood bedroom at the estate on day 3 because she couldn't afford to heat her condo, and she ate the food that Estelle cooked, and she told herself it was within the rules because the estate was family property and she was a family member. Harold called her on day 17 and explained that the estate's food supply was a family resource that she had converted to personal use and that her participation was concluded. Caleb had never had a realistic chance. He had moved in with a law school friend on day 2 and spent the month watching television and eating the friend's food and periodically texting his siblings for updates. Harold called him on day 21 to inform him officially, though the call was largely a formality. None of them called Deja. She would not have expected it. She was 38 cents short on day 23. It was a Wednesday. She was at the grocery store in the checkout line with a can of tomatoes and a packet of dried pasta and a small jar of peanut butter, and she had counted before she got in line, and she had been off by 38 cents because the pasta had been re-tagged since the last time she checked, and she was standing at the register doing the arithmetic in her head, and it was coming out wrong. The woman behind her in line was named Carlotta, and she was perhaps 60. And she was wearing a caregiver's badge from a home health agency 2 towns over, and she had the particular posture of a woman who had been on her feet for 11 hours and was making one stop on the way home before she allowed herself to sit down. She was buying a can of soup and a box of saltines and a small carton of orange juice. She watched Deja counting at the register, and she did not make a show of watching, and she did not tilt her head or make a sympathetic sound. She simply reached into the pocket of her scrubs and put 2 quarters on the belt beside the peanut butter. She did not make it a moment. She looked at the register display. She did not look at Deja. The cashier, a young man of perhaps 20, with the careful patience of someone who had seen every version of this, ran the quarters through without comment and gave Deja 12 cents in change. Deja looked at the 2 quarters now in the cashier's hand. She thought about refusing. She thought about pride, which she knew was a real thing and not always wrong. And then she thought about something older and wiser than pride, something she had learned in the group home and carried since she was 7 years old, which was that grace received is not the same as debt owed, and that the right response to someone who sees you clearly is not to flinch away from being seen. She said softly, "Thank you." Carlotta said, "Get home safe." That was all. She had already moved her soup and crackers forward on the belt. She was not waiting for anything. Deja took her bag and walked out into the evening air and stood for a moment on the sidewalk with the cold coming off the parking lot concrete and the smell of rain somewhere close, and she breathed. She thought about Carlotta the whole walk home. She thought about how many times she had done exactly what Carlotta had done. The unremarked gesture, the quiet supplement, the 2 quarters offered not as pity, but as fellow feeling. One person who knew what counting felt like seeing another. She had done it for families on her caseload. She had done it for people at bus, for May. She had done it for people at bus stops and in lines at the laundromat and in the break room at work. She had never thought of it as a principle. It had just been what you did when you could because someone had done it for you once and you did not forget. She went home and wrote 38 cents in the debit column of her ledger and 2 quarters in the received column and the net 12 cents in the surplus column, and moved on. On day 27, she had $2.41 remaining. She had eaten every day. She had gotten to work every day. She had paid nothing late, broken nothing, and borrowed from no one except 38 cents from a stranger who hadn't called it a loan. She spent the last 3 days eating rice and the beans she had left and a portion of maize greens. She drank water. She walked. On the morning of day 31, a Sunday, she drove to the estate outside Charlotte in her 7-year-old hatchback. She had filled the gas tank with the $2.41, which was enough for half a tank on a car that ran lean, and she arrived at 10 in the morning with 97 cents in her pocket and a spiral notebook under her arm. The estate was large and quiet. Estelle met her at the door with the same warm, steady look she had given Deja since the adoption, the look of a woman who had watched something fragile become something durable and felt proprietary about it. "Your father's in the study," Estelle said. "Are the others here?" "They called this morning." Estelle's expression did not change. "Said they'd be along when they could." They were not coming. Deja understood this after a moment. They already knew. She found Raymond in his study at the back of the house, in the leather chair by the window that faced the back garden, where the oak trees had gone fully gold and were beginning to let go. He was smaller than she remembered from the summer. The month had been long for him too, she thought, in ways she did not yet know. She sat across from him and placed the notebook on the coffee table between them. He looked at it for a moment. "Show me," he said. She opened it to the first page and walked him through it. Every cent, every meal. The beans and the rice and the cornmeal, the bus pass and the 4-mile walks, the discounted pork neck, the 38 cents from Carlotta, the $2.41 she had arrived with. Raymond was quiet for a long time. He had grown up in a house in rural North Carolina where the heat came from a single wood stove and the food budget was a prayer and a small envelope of cash that his mother managed with the focused precision of a person who understood that the difference between enough and not enough was $2 and no room for error. He had left that house at 17 with $70 and a bus ticket and a ferocity he had never entirely lost. He had slept on a cousin's floor in Charlotte for 6 months and worked 2 jobs and saved $1,400 over a year and a half and used it to start a small freight brokerage out of a converted closet in an office building on the east side. He had built the money over 50 years by understanding, at the molecular level, the cost of every decision. When he hired people, he hired them for the thing they could not hide, which was whether they knew what something cost, not the sticker price, the real cost, the cost in time and labor and sacrifice and what you were giving up to get it. He had given his children everything, and they had not learned to count. He had watched them for 40 years. He had watched Marcus spend the inheritance of a small country on properties that looked good in a portfolio and never turned a profit. He had watched Simone build the family company for work that the family company did not need, with the comfortable assurance of someone who had never been required to justify a number. He had watched Caleb drift from one prestigious beginning to the next without landing, without the specific gravity that only comes from needing something badly enough that you count to get it. He had not watched Deja the same way. This was his error, and he had known it for some time. He had watched Deja differently, with the wariness of a man who suspects he already knows the answer and does not want to be wrong. He had given her everything he gave the others. The same schools, the same summers, the same dinner tables, the same accounts. He had worried that it had worked on her too, that the comfort had covered over the thing he had seen at the courthouse in Greensboro, the way snow covers a field and makes you forget that the ground is there. The notebook in his daughter's hands told him the ground was still there. It had worn at him in a way he had not told anyone about, the grief of a man who can see the gap between what he built and what he passed down. He hadn't known until this morning which side of that gap Deja stood on. He had adopted Deja because of the look on her face at the courthouse in Greensboro. He had not been able to explain it to Eleanor, his wife, who had gone along with the adoption out of a generosity he had always admired and never quite understood. He had seen something in that 9-year-old in the borrowed dress, a quality he recognized from his own childhood, the quality of a child who had already learned to count and had already decided that counting was not the same as losing. He had wondered, in the 22 years since, whether he had been wrong. Whether the money had gotten to her too, whether the private schools and the family dinners and the summers on the coast had smoothed away the thing he had seen. He looked at the notebook. He looked at his daughter. "You had 38 cents from Carlotta," he said. "I did," Deja said. "I wrote it down. You walked 4 miles. 8 round trip, most days." He turned a page, then another. His handwriting was in some of the margins, she noticed, small notes he had made as she walked him through it. He had been tracking along. He had been checking the arithmetic. "You have 97 cents, he said. 97 cents, she confirmed. He closed the notebook. He looked out at the gold oaks for a moment. "Your brothers and sister," he said. "Marcus is in Atlanta. Simone went to her friend's place in Asheville. Caleb is at Devon's. I know. Did you talk to any of them? No. He nodded slowly. He seemed to be deciding something. I want to tell you something I've never told you directly, he said. He was not a man who used the word never lightly, and she sat still. The day I signed your papers, you wore a blue dress. I borrowed it, she said, from a girl named Tanya. You had your hands folded in your lap the whole time. You watched the attorney's pen move across the page. You didn't look at me. I was watching to make sure it was real. He was quiet. Outside, a fistful of gold leaves came loose from the nearest oak and scattered across the brown grass. I've been watching you watch things become real your whole life, he said. I don't think I've told you what I see when I watch you do that. She was very still. I see my mother, he said, in her kitchen, counting. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not cost something she wanted to keep, and so she sat with what he had given her and let it settle. What happened next took 2 weeks to make official. Harold drew up the documents quietly and without announcement. Raymond restructured the family trust and named Deja as the executive trustee of the charitable division, the portion of the Crane estate that funded scholarship programs and community health initiatives in 4 counties. It was not the glamour of the investment portfolio or the title of president. It was, Raymond told her privately, the part that mattered, the part that had always mattered, the part he had never trusted to anyone because he had never seen anyone who understood that money is not the point. The point is what the money costs and who it costs and whether the person holding it knows the difference. He gave each of his 3 other children a letter. In it, he wrote that they would inherit their shares at the appropriate time and that he loved them and that he wanted them to spend the next year learning something he had failed to teach them. He recommended they speak with Deja. He did not require it. Marcus did not call for 3 months. When he did, he asked Deja to have lunch with him in Atlanta. And she went, and they sat in a booth in a diner on the west side that he had chosen because he said he thought she would like it. And she noticed that he had ordered water instead of the imported sparkling he usually ordered, and she did not say anything about it. They talked for 2 hours. She paid her half of the check, $11 and some change, and on the walk back to her car she thought about how strange and ordinary it was, the particular math of beginning. Simone came around more slowly. Caleb sent a card, a handwritten one, which Deja kept on the small bookshelf beside her door. She kept her job at the county for 3 more years. She had a caseload that had by then grown to 24 families, and she carried it the way she had always carried things, with both hands and without complaint. She took on the trustee role in the evenings and on weekends, and she met with grant applicants and community partners. And she sat in rooms where the money was being allocated, and she asked the questions she had always asked. What does it cost? Who carries the cost? Do they know they are not alone? In the spring of the 2nd year, she hired Carlotta. She had gone looking for her deliberately, which had taken some time because she had only known a first name and a home health badge from an agency 2 towns over. She had called the agency and described the woman, and a supervisor had known immediately who she meant. And Carlotta had called back that evening and listened to the offer and asked twice if Deja was serious, and then said, quietly, that she would need to think about it. She called back 2 days later. She said, yes. She became the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Crane Charitable Division, a title that did not fully describe what she actually did, which was to find the people who were $2 short of enough and make sure they were not invisible. She was good at it. She had spent 30 years learning to see. Raymond lived 4 more years after that October. He spent most of them at the estate, and Deja visited every few weeks, and they sat in the study by the window and talked about the families she was working with and the grants she was considering and the question of how to do the most good with the least waste. He asked questions. He made notes in the margins of her reports. He disagreed with her sometimes sharply, and she pushed back, and he liked it. On his last good day, he called her to the study in the afternoon. The oaks were bare, the same oaks that had been gold the day she had come with her notebook, and the light was the pale, thin light of late November. He had something in his hand. She recognized it when she got close. It was a coin purse, old brown leather, the kind you do not find anymore, worn smooth at the seams. My mother's, he said. She counted from this her whole life. He held it out. She took it. It was light. She opened the clasp, and inside were 2 coins. An old dime and a penny, so worn that the dates were gone. 11 cents, she said. 11 cents, he said. She said that was what she had left when my father came home from the hospital the last time. She said she had kept it ever since, so she would remember what enough feels like when you have exactly nothing. Deja held the purse in both hands. You've always known what enough feels like, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He seemed to be deciding whether to agree. He had spent 50 years building what was enough into something enormous, and he was not always sure, in the quiet moments, whether the building had clarified the feeling or obscured it. He thought about October. He thought about a spiral notebook and a blue dress borrowed from a girl named Tanya. You knew, he said. You've always known. She did not disagree. She closed the coin purse and held it in her lap, and they sat together while the November light moved across the bare oaks, and neither of them said anything else. And the quiet between them was the specific kind of quiet that two people share when the thing that needed saying has finally, completely been said. She kept the coin purse on the same bookshelf as Caleb's card. She took it down sometimes in the evenings when a particularly hard day had left her sitting at her kitchen table with the week's ledger in front of her and the familiar arithmetic of not quite enough running through her head. She would hold it and feel the worn leather and think about Raymond's mother at her kitchen table with her 11 cents. And she would think about Carlotta at the register with her 2 quarters, and she would think about May and her greens and Tanya and her blue dress and all the small, unremarked transactions of grace that had moved between people who had very little and had given it anyway. The world, she had decided a long time ago, did not run on the big money. It ran on the $40. It ran on the 38 cents. It ran on the 2 quarters laid on a grocery belt by a woman who did not look at you so you would not have to look away. She understood what Raymond had been trying to say with the challenge. She had understood it the moment the envelope arrived. He had needed to know whether any of his children could still count, whether any of them still knew the feel of the floor, whether any of them, in the stripped-down arithmetic of a single October month, would recognize what mattered and hold on to it with both hands. She had been holding on with both hands since she was 9 years old, in a borrowed blue dress in a courthouse in Greensboro. She had never stopped. Have you ever known someone who was wealthier than they appeared? Someone whose real worth was in what they understood, not what they owned? Leave a comment. I think you have. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting, about a woman who gave something away that she could not afford to lose, and what came back to her years later. Stay close to that one. This is a work of dramatic fiction. The characters, events, and institutions in this story are imaginary and are used to explore themes of dignity, sacrifice, and inherited wisdom.